He said it like he was reading off a grocery list, and that was the part she couldn't forgive. Not the words themselves, but the absolute lack of weight behind them. No one else would have taken a wife with a limp and a dead father's debts, Nathaniel Reed said, reaching for the butter dish like the sentence hadn't just cracked something open at the table. Eleanor Whitcomb set down her fork. She did not cry. She folded her napkin into a neat square, the way her grandmother had taught her, rose from her chair, and dropped into a curtsy so precise it looked rehearsed, though she had never rehearsed it in her life. Then she walked out of the dining room and did not come back for breakfast, or for lunch, or ever again. The morning had started ordinarily enough, which was the cruelest thing about it. Eleanor had been buttering toast when her mother-in-law, Mrs. Reed, began the daily inventory of household failures. The coffee was weak. The hallway runner had a curled corner that someone might trip on. The maid had pressed Nathaniel's collar wrong, though Eleanor suspected the collar was fine, and the complaint was really about something else entirely, the way Mrs. Reed's complaints usually were. "I do hope you'll speak to Patsy about the ironing," Mrs. Reed said, not looking up from her tea. "Standards do slip when no one minds them." "I'll mind them this afternoon," Eleanor said. "See that you do." This was the rhythm of every morning in the Reed house, in Millbrook, Connecticut, a town built on textile money and old grudges, where Eleanor had lived for 3 years now as the wife of a man who had married her the autumn her father's mill went under. It had not been romantic. Everyone in town knew it hadn't been romantic. Daniel Whitcomb had owed money to half the county and left his daughter with nothing but a name people no longer trusted, and Nathaniel Reed, son of the family that owned the bank holding most of that debt, had married her in a transaction so plainly practical that the minister had nearly forgotten to ask if anyone objected. Because why would anyone object to arithmetic? Eleanor had walked into the marriage with her eyes open. She had not expected tenderness. She had hoped, in the quiet, unguarded place, where hope lives whether or not you give it permission, that competence might eventually earn something like respect. 3 years of running the Reed household without a single complaint that could be proven. 3 years of keeping the books in a hand so clean the bank manager once asked who'd trained her. 3 years of absorbing Mrs. Reed's daily audits without ever once raising her voice. None of it had earned anything. It had simply become the baseline, the floor, the thing that was expected and therefore invisible. Nathaniel came down a few minutes later, jacket half on, smelling of the stable, and sat without greeting anyone. He poured his coffee. He did not look at his wife. He never really looked at his wife in the mornings, Eleanor had noticed. The way you stop noticing the furniture is even there. "The Albright girl is back from Boston," Mrs. Reed said, watching her son over the rim of her cup. "Quite accomplished now, I'm told. We ought to have the family for supper." "Fine. Speak to Eleanor about a date." "I rather think it would mean more coming from you, dear." Nathaniel glanced up, irritated at being asked to perform a task he considered beneath him. "Why does it need to come from me at all?" "Because the Albrights are particular people. They'll expect a certain standard of hospitality, and..." Mrs. Reed let the sentence trail off in the way she always did when she wanted the silence to finish her thought for her. He looked at his mother. He looked at his wife. He went back to his coffee, and what came out of his mouth next was delivered with the terrible calm of a man stating something he had long since stopped considering unkind. "No one else would have taken a wife with a limp and a dead father's debts," he said. "Eleanor understands the arrangement. The Albrights understand how the world works. Invite them yourself, mother." This was from a carriage accident when she was 9, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and for 3 years he had never once mentioned it, which was somehow worse than if he had mentioned it constantly, because it meant he had simply been keeping it filed away as a fact about her, alongside her father's debts, alongside everything else that made her, in his accounting, a discount rather than a person. The room went still. Mrs. Reed's teacup clicked against its saucer in a silence that settled its teeth. Eleanor did not move for a moment. She sat with her spine straight and her hands flat on either side of her plate, and felt the sentence land somewhere cold and slow inside her. The particular kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself with tears, because it's too clean a cut for that, too matter-of-fact, like a man describing livestock he'd gotten a fair price on. Then she rose. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, the small precise gesture she had carried since girlhood. The one she made when she was gathering herself for something irreversible. She curtsied, low and deliberate, a curtsy that was not deference but conclusion, the closing of a door so quietly that it was somehow louder than slamming it would have been. "Excuse me," she said, and walked out. Her bedroom door did not slam either. She closed it the way she had curtsied, controlled, exact, and stood in the middle of the room with her eyes shut, breathing once, twice before she crossed to the wardrobe and began to pack. She worked fast and without waste. 2 dresses, practical ones, her mother's shawl, her father's pocket watch, the one thing of his that hadn't gone to settle his debts, and 3 years of coins set aside a few at a time from the household accounts. Never enough to be noticed, always enough to be building toward something she hadn't let herself name until this exact morning. A soft knock came. Eleanor. Her mother's voice careful. "Come in." Ruth Whitcomb stepped inside, saw the bag on the bed, and said nothing for a long moment. "How long have you been planning this?" she finally asked. "I haven't been planning it. I've been prepared for it." "There's a difference." Ruth closed the door behind her and watched her daughter fold a dress with the steady hands of a woman who understood exactly what kind of leaving this was. "He didn't mean it the way it sounded," she offered, more out of habit than belief. "He meant it exactly the way it sounded. That's the trouble, Mama. I have run this household for 3 years without a single mistake anyone could point to, and the truest thing he can say about me, in front of my own mother, is that no one else would have taken me." She closed the bag. "I am done being a discount." Ruth's eyes moved over her daughter's face. Something like pride mixed up with grief in there, the particular ache of a mother watching a child learn a hard lesson too early. "Come with me to find somewhere," Eleanor said, before her mother could ask. "I was about to ask the same of you. There's nothing here for either of us." They were down the back stairs and out through the kitchen door, before the breakfast dishes were cleared, Eleanor having left a note on Nathaniel's desk that read, in full, "Nathaniel, I am leaving. Do not come looking. The accounts are reconciled through Tuesday. The hallway runner has been fixed." She'd almost added something about the toast. She decided against it. They took the morning stage as far as Brattleboro, then a hired cart driven by a quiet man named Otis Bell, who asked no questions and seemed grateful for the silence, up into the hill country of Vermont, where a letter from a former housemaid's cousin had described a town called Asher's Run. Small, tucked into a valley, the kind of place where a capable woman was worth more than the shape of her leg or the size of her dowry. It was Ruth who fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder, somewhere past the second ridge, and Eleanor who sat watching the road, deliberately not thinking about Nathaniel, which is its own kind of thinking about someone. Back in Millbrook, the household did not collapse, but it began to fray in the way only the absence of an invisible hand can cause a house to fray. The accounts didn't balance because no one else understood Eleanor's system. A scheduled tea went unattended because it had only ever lived in Eleanor's diary. Mrs. Reed sat in the study one morning a week later, going through the ledgers with the focused frustration of a woman who had found them wanting. And when Nathaniel came in she said, without looking up, "These accounts are a disaster. Eleanor kept those, which is precisely why they're a disaster to anyone but her." She looked up. "She's not coming back on her own, Nathaniel. You don't know that. I know Eleanor Whitcomb. I have been underestimating her since the day you brought her into this house, and I think we both know it now." Mrs. Reed rose, smoothed her skirt, and stopped at the door without turning. "What you said at that table was beneath you. I am telling you that I know it. Whether that changes anything is your business." She left him alone with the ledger and his mother's words sitting in the room like furniture rearranged while he wasn't looking. Asher's Run, when they reached it, was a valley town of millers and dairy farmers, the kind of place where disputes got settled over a fence post, rather than in a courtroom 3 counties away. The first person they met was a boy of about 11, perched on a gate with a piece of Timothy grass in his teeth, who looked at their bags and announced, with the flat authority of a child who has learned to read adults, that they were looking for Caleb Burrows, and that he was up at the cider mill. Caleb Burrows turned out to be a lean man near 60 with hands like rope, who looked Eleanor over with the thorough unhostile attention of someone sizing up a tool rather than a stranger. "Your husband know you're here?" he asked. "My husband knows I'm gone. The rest is my business." Something in his face settled at that. "You want water? Warm day for traveling." She told him she could read a ledger and a land survey both, her father having been a mill owner who'd taught her bookkeeping before he taught her to read novels, and that she understood there'd been some trouble over the water rights on the mill pond, shared by 4 families who couldn't agree on whose grandfather had dug the original channel. 4 families and 4 different stories, Caleb said. Been arguing it for going on 7 years. Then the stories are useless as they stand. Show me the original deeds. It took her 35 minutes spread across his work table. to find the surveying error from 2 decades back, a misread elevation mark that had propagated through every subsequent claim like a crack running through ice. By the next morning, word had moved through Asher's Run the way it moves through small towns, fast and total, and Eleanor found herself at the kitchen table of the widow she was boarding with, Mrs. Aldous Pike, listening to one neighbor after another lay out a dispute over a fence, a well, a parcel sold twice to 2 different men. Within a week she had more work than she could finish in a month, and her mother watched her daughter sit at that table with her sleeves rolled and her hair coming loose and looking, for the first time in 3 years, entirely like herself. "He had no idea what you could do," Ruth said one evening. "No," Eleanor agreed. "Neither, I think, had I forgotten." A letter arrived 3 weeks later, from a lawyer in Hartford, on Nathaniel's behalf, informing her in careful language that there were questions to settle regarding the disposition of the Whitcomb Mill property, which had passed to the Reed estate as part of the marriage arrangement. Eleanor read it twice, folded it, and set it down without comment. "Is he threatening you?" Ruth asked. "He's reminding me what belongs to him now. I don't think he means it as a threat. I think it's how he explains the shape of things to himself." She tucked the letter into her apron pocket. "He wants to know if the land will pull me back. Let him wonder." It was Caleb who found her later that day, cross-referencing a deed against a county survey behind the mill. "Got the look of a woman who got a letter she didn't care for," he said. "My husband's lawyer wrote about the mill, my father's mill, and your husband. Leads with property. People are harder for him." She paused. "He'll come, I expect. Sooner or later men like that always do. What'll you do when he does?" She traced a survey line with her fingertip, certain and clean. "I'll be someone different than the woman he married," she said, "and he'll have to decide what to do with that." The writer found her at the crossroads on a Friday evening 3 weeks after that, dusty and uncertain, holding an envelope addressed in handwriting she knew at once. Not the lawyer's careful script, Nathaniel's own hand, slightly less controlled than usual, as if it had been written and rewritten before this version survived. "I said something at that table I have not been able to account for since. I am not asking you to come back. I am asking if you would permit me to say what I should have said instead." She told the writer only that she had received it, and that was all for now, and walked back to Mrs. Pike's with the letter in her pocket and her hands not entirely steady. Her reply, when she sent it 4 days later, was 4 sentences. "Nathaniel, I received your letter. I am not prepared to discuss what you should have said at a breakfast table 3 weeks ago. If you have something to say, you know where I am. Whether you come is your decision, not mine." He arrived on the 6th day after, on a horse that had earned its rest, having spent the entire ride rehearsing sensible things to say, and abandoning every one of them somewhere around the 2nd day. The boy on the gate told him she was at the mill settling the water dispute, and was, in the boy's words, good at it. Delivered without particular wonder, as if this were simply established fact in Asher's Run by now. He heard her before he saw her, a voice carrying the calm, unperformed authority of someone who didn't need to raise it. He stood in the doorway and watched her point at a map for 4 men gathered around a table, her sleeves rolled, her hair pinned looser than he'd ever seen it, looking more alive than he could remember her, looking in 3 years of marriage. She looked up. The room went quiet. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Mrs. Reed." The men filed out, the last one giving Nathaniel the long, assessing look of a man taking another man's measure and reserving judgment. Then they were alone, and the silence between them had weight to it. "You came," she said. "You said if I had something to say, I knew where you were. Do you have something to say?" He had rehearsed an apology for 4 days on horseback and discovered, standing in front of her, that the rehearsed version was useless. "What I said at breakfast was wrong," he said. "Not wrong because it wasn't what I thought. Wrong because I should never have thought it in those terms at all. You are not a discount, Eleanor. You have never been a discount, and I said it like you were nothing, and I have not been able to unsay it since." That's not an apology, Nathaniel. That's a man explaining why he feels bad. It landed exactly the way she'd meant it to. "Then tell me what one would look like." "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't decided." He found Caleb at the general store an hour later, and Caleb sat beside him on the bench without being asked, unhurried, and told him plainly that Eleanor had come in with 2 bags, and a mother and shoulders carrying 4 years more weight than they should have, and that in 3 weeks she'd settled a 7-year water dispute and taught half the valley's children their multiplication tables on the side. "She smiles now," Caleb said. "Didn't used to, I'd wager." "What do you actually want from her?" Caleb asked. "Not what you've been telling yourself. What do you want?" "I want to know her," Nathaniel said, and it surprised him how true it sounded out loud. I have lived with this woman for 3 years, and I do not know what she loves to read. The real turn came the next morning, when Ruth Whitcomb walked into the dining room at Mrs. Pike's where Nathaniel was finishing breakfast, and sat across from him without invitation. "Before you say anything," she said, "I want you to listen, and not respond until I've finished. Can you do that?" He nodded. "What you don't know. What no one has told you, because I asked Eleanor not to, and she listened to me, and I have regretted it for 3 years, is that the week before your wedding, your mother wrote my daughter a letter." Ruth's hands were folded, her voice steady in a way that was somehow more frightening than if it had shaken. It thanked Eleanor for accepting the arrangement. It outlined her duties. And in the last paragraph, in your mother's particular way of saying something devastating, as if it were simply practical, it told my 22-year-old daughter that you were marrying for stability, not sentiment, and that she should calibrate her expectations accordingly. She paused. She was told, in writing, before she ever walked through your door, not to expect to be loved. Nathaniel sat very still. She never told you. She thought if she worked hard enough, the terms might change on their own. Ruth leaned forward slightly. She was not waiting to be loved, Nathaniel. She had given up on that years ago. She was waiting to be seen. That's all she ever wanted. She stood. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. I'm telling you, because you cannot apologize properly for something you don't understand the size of." He found Eleanor that afternoon, and told her his mother had written to him, that he knew about the letter now, and that he needed to hear it from her own mouth. She told him, without drama, in the same clear voice she used for survey disputes, the exact paragraph she had read on an October afternoon and never fully set down. When she finished, he said, "I am sorry, for the letter, for the table, for 3 years of treating you like the arrangement instead of the person. For every morning I reached for the coffee and didn't say good morning." His voice had gone rough. "I am sorry for all of it. I know you are," she said. "Is that enough?" "No," she said herself before he could answer. "Not yet, but it's something." He stayed. He repointed a section of stone wall along Caleb's property over 2 days, because Caleb's shoulder couldn't manage it anymore, working with the unhurried competence of a man who'd once known how to use his hands before he'd let himself stop. He danced with her at a barn supper that Saturday, badly at first, and then not badly at all, the two of them laughing in a way neither had laughed together in 3 years, surprised by the sound of it. His mother arrived the following Wednesday, in a hired coach she found beneath her, and Eleanor met her at the road, standing on her own ground with her chin level. They sat together in Mrs. Pike's kitchen, and Mrs. Reed said the thing she had clearly traveled 2 days to say. "I told myself it was kindness, sparing you illusions. It was not kindness. It was telling a young woman before she'd even arrived that she shouldn't expect to matter. That was wrong, and I am not accustomed to being wrong without good reason, and I find I no longer have one." She produced a letter already signed, releasing any claim on profits from a recently surveyed timber stand on the old mill property that had, it turned out, been worth considerably more than anyone had accounted for at the time of the marriage. A fact Mrs. Reed admitted she had heard rumored before the wedding, and chosen not to confirm. "You came a long way to say that," Eleanor said. "I could have written it. You chose not to. I chose not to." It was Ruth, days later at supper, who finally asked the question that had been circling the table. "What are we doing, all of us? Because I am 58 years old and I'd like to know where I'll be sleeping in 6 months." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel, and told him plainly what she needed. Not gentler treatment, not better manners, but the whole shape of the household changed, the accounts managed jointly, decisions made with her voice equal to his, her work in Asher's Run kept and not folded away to make a bigger house more comfortable. "Yes," he said, before she'd even finished. "All of it. Nathaniel, I'm serious. I know you are. I'm not agreeing to end the conversation. I mean it." He looked at her. "I want you to come home, not back to what it was, home to what it could be, with you fully in it, the way you've been here. I want to know what you're thinking at breakfast. I want to be worth talking to. If we go back," she said, "Asher's Run stays mine. The work here doesn't disappear because I'm in a bigger house." Of course, they left together on a Saturday, all three of them, Caleb standing at the end of the road to see them off. "I'll be back in the spring," she told him. "The Hargrove boundary's still a mess. I'll have it ready," he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "He did good too for what it's worth." "I know," she said. "I saw." The Reed house was different when they returned, not in its furniture but in the way a house is different when the people inside it have changed. Mornings came quieter and more equal. Mrs. Reed checked the hallway runner herself now, without being asked, and said so without being thanked for it, which was, in its own way, its own kind of apology repeated daily. Eleanor opened a small office above the dry goods store that winter, her name on the door beside Nathaniel's, and county clerks, who would not have answered a woman's letter 2 years prior, answered hers promptly now, because a Reed's signature still carried weight, and she had decided she would use what was useful without apologizing for it. She had walked out of that dining room a woman who knew, in some buried unspoken way, what she was worth. She came back a woman who had proven it, not to Nathaniel, not to his mother, but to herself, in her own hand, on her own ground. And that was the only proof that had ever mattered. The woman who sat waiting to be seen was gone for good, and in her place was someone who saw herself clearly enough that being seen by anyone else was simply, finally, beside the point.